The sun had barely climbed over the jagged hills when the ground trembled, not from an earthquake, but suppose the footsteps of a single man. His shadow stretched long across the Valley of Elah, dark and wide as a storm cloud, and his voice tore through the morning air like thunder. "Choose your champion!" he roared, his words echoing against the cliffs. The Philistine lines erupted in cheers, their armor flashing in the light like the scales of a serpent. On the opposite ridge, the Israelite army stood silent. No one stepped forward. No one dared. Goliath, a man who seemed less human and more a living fortress, was defying Israel, and by extension, the God of Israel. For 40 days he had walked into the valley with the arrogance of a predator who knew no equal. This was not just a battle for territory. It was a spiritual collision, a clash that shook not only kingdoms on earth, but the gates of hell itself. The Valley of Elah lay between two ridges, a natural stage for what was to come. To the west, the Philistines had set their camp, warriors hardened by years of conquest. To the east, King Saul's forces stood on high ground, their banners hanging in the still air. Between them stretched open ground, treacherous for any army to cross without becoming easy prey. For ancient armies, the risk of total slaughter in such terrain was too high, so the Philistines proposed a champion's duel, a common practice in ancient warfare where one warrior would fight on behalf of his nation and the outcome would decide the fate of the armies. But Goliath was no ordinary champion. Standing over 9 feet tall, clad in bronze armor heavier than most men, he wielded a spear whose iron tip alone weighed more than some swords. His presence was meant to terrify, and it did. Day after day, Israel's bravest men avoided his challenge. Even Saul, a head taller than any man in Israel, did not move from his tent. The tension in the valley was no longer just military, it was psychological. Each day of silence deepened the shame. Far from the valley, in the hills of Bethlehem, a young shepherd named David was tending his father's sheep. Barely old enough to fight in Saul's army, and he was tasked with bringing provisions to his older brothers, who served among Israel's ranks. When David arrived at the camp, he found the soldiers not preparing for battle, but murmuring in fear. And then he heard it, the deep, mocking voice of Goliath booming across the valley. David's brow furrowed. This wasn't just a Philistine defying Israel. This was a pagan mocking the name of the living God. To David, this was not a military problem. It was a blasphemy that could not go unanswered. While others saw a giant too big to defeat, David saw a mortal man defying an immortal God. And that, in his mind, sealed Goliath's fate. David's words spread quickly through the ranks, eventually reaching King Saul. The king summoned the boy, perhaps expecting a nervous youth, but instead found someone who spoke with a confidence far beyond his years. David recounted how he had defended his flock from lions and bears, striking them down when they attacked. To him, Goliath was just another predator, only louder. Saul hesitated. He offered David his own armor, but when David tried it on, the weight slowed him. He stripped it off, choosing instead the tools he knew best, a shepherd's staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones taken from the brook. To the soldiers, it looked like madness. To David, it was faith in action. He knew victory would not come from steel or strength, but from the God who had delivered him before. The Philistine army erupted in laughter as David stepped into the valley. To them, this was an insult, a boy with no armor, no sword, and only a sling. Goliath sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" he bellowed, cursing David by the names of his gods. His threats were not merely insults, they were invocations, calling on Philistine deities to curse David's life and legacy. But David answered with words that would echo through history. "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." This was no longer a contest between man and boy, it was a spiritual showdown. Every soldier watching knew that what happened next would define the faith and courage of two nations. The air in the valley grew still as the two moved closer. Goliath, confident and slow, raised his spear. David, swift and unarmored, ran forward. In one motion, he placed a stone into his sling and began to spin it. The whir of the sling cut through the silence like the winding of fate itself. Then, release. The stone shot forward with the speed of a bullet, striking Goliath in the forehead. For a moment, the giant stood as if nothing had happened. Then his knees buckled, and the earth shook as he fell face first into the dust. The Philistine champion, terror of Israel, was dead before he hit the ground. And in that instant, it was as if the roar of hell had been silenced. The demonic mockery that had taunted Israel for 40 days was gone, replaced by the stunned silence of thousands of soldiers. David ran to Goliath's massive body and drew the giant's own sword, a weapon so large it seemed impossible for him to wield. Yet, with a single decisive motion, he ended the fight completely, severing Goliath's head. The sight sent waves of panic through the Philistine army. Their champion was gone, their confidence shattered. The Israelites, emboldened by the sudden shift, surged forward in pursuit, driving the enemy back to their cities. It was more than a military victory, it was a statement. The God of Israel had defended his people in the most unexpected way, using the smallest warrior to defeat the greatest threat. David's triumph would become legend, sung in the streets of Israel, celebrated in the courts of kings, and feared by Israel's enemies for generations. The battle of David and Goliath did not end in the valley. Its echoes reached far into the spiritual realm. To the Israelites, it was proof that God could turn the tide of history with the most unlikely of instruments. To the Philistines, it was a shattering defeat that exposed the weakness of their gods. In later years, David himself would face greater trials: political betrayal, rebellion, and personal sin. But the victory over Goliath would remain a defining moment. It marked him not just as a warrior, but as a man after God's own heart, willing to step into the valley when no one else would. And in the corridors of hell, the memory of that day stood as a reminder. No matter how loud evil roars, the voice of faith speaks louder. You've just uncovered another hidden chapter of history with animated Bible mysteries. If you enjoyed this journey, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story where the Bible's words, ancient legends, and divine mysteries come together. Until next time, heaven holds the secrets. Never stop searching.